Yeah,
can you see me okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Great. Thank you everyone for being part of this conversation. Thank you to all my co-panelists. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the PSA, some of the intricacies of it, why it's been described as a lawless law, talk a little bit about impact, how it fits within the broader sort of legal architecture within Kashmir, and then leave with two specific closing observations, both around Kashmir in the international context and some of what my colleague and friend, Professor Baidoon, talked about with respect to authoritarianism and Hindutva supremacy in India. The PSA has been widely described as a lawless law. And that's because the statute and those who justify it routinely used language like security of the state, good faith, and public order. It is per se illegal under international human rights law and unconstitutional, I would argue, under Indian law. And that's because it allows for preventive detention, right? And so when we think about the law, you don't have to be a lawyer to understand this. The general idea is that you can only be stopped, let alone arrested, if there is evidence of a crime. In this case, as we know from the prior panelists who've shared, with respect to the PSA, that evidence isn't required. People can be held for 2 years without trial or charge. And in some cases, it's actually used as a revolving door. And so folks will be released under the PSA because the time may have expired or because the government feels the charges may not be as strong as they could be. And then they will arrest them under another PSA. And so there have been times where people have been held and rearrested sort of on a staggered basis using this discriminatory law. It's also often used as a form of collective punishment. And so what do I mean by that? There have been numerous instances throughout the year where the alleged suspect can't be found. And as a mechanism for bringing them out and arresting them, the government actually arrests their friends and family. Furthermore, if the government determines that specifying the very reason for the arrest would somehow contravene the public interest, they don't even have to state that. And so this is why, again, this has been routinely called a lawless law, and international bodies who've looked at it, including the United Nations and international bodies, have found that it violates basic fundamental human rights norms. And so let's talk a little bit about the impact. And again, here, I just want to reiterate some of the remarks of my panelists. This law has been used to arrest journalists. It's been used to arrest political leaders, activists, religious leaders, and perhaps more importantly, it's also been used to arrest everyone and anyone. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the law, again, by its very nature, is so ambiguous that the Indian government has at times just used it and used its provisions to just engage in mass arrests, and in some cases to just pick up people randomly off the street. And so this has, apart from the actual concrete impact, and we heard about this today, right? People languish in jails, people deprived of legal counsel, people not being able to see their family. We heard about how in some cases people arrested are transferred out of state, hundreds and thousands of miles away. But there's also this unbelievably strong chilling impact, right? If you run the risk that you can be arrested at any time, kept behind bars for 2 years, deprived of the ability to know why you're being charged, deprived of the ability to contest the charges, let alone have a trial, it's going to have this chilling impact. And truthfully, credit to the Kashmiri people, credit to activists there that they've continued to resist despite this authoritarian draconian law. The broader context. It's also important to remember that the PSA and the other laws that have been discussed today are also being used within a broader context of authoritarianism. And so we know that India leads the world in internet shutdowns and mobile phone blackouts. We know that India has repeatedly imposed restrictions on the freedom of movement, people's ability to congregate, organize, leave their homes, in some cases gather in groups more than 3 to 4 people. They've limited at times the ability for people to meet publicly, including at houses of worship. And we also know, because again, this has been documented, that Kashmir has been the site of major human rights atrocity. And so I want to mention 2 things in particular. One, torture, and second, enforced disappearances. We know that it's been well documented that people who've been detained under the PSA have been tortured. There were reports confirmed by BBC, Time Magazine, The Washington Post, and others, that Kashmiri activists were subject to some of the same torture methods that were used on detainees at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. This is just as of a few years ago. And again, this has been going on for some time. We also know that there have been enforced disappearances. And here again, I would defer you to the works of and the work of excellent human rights organizations in the region that have documented human rights abuses, enforced disappearances, and torture that have been going on in Kashmir for a very long time, not just in the last few years. I want to conclude with 2 observations. And again, both of these have been made, and I kind of just want to tease them out a little more. One, the entire world should be paying attention to Kashmir. In part, as Professor Beydoun says, because it is a site of imperialism, right? It is an imperial project. But apart from that, what we've also seen is that the same legal architecture that is being used in Kashmir is increasingly being used elsewhere to suppress activism, freedom of movement, the ability to organize, the ability to speak, the ability to truth tell. And also the same militarization and same violence is also being replicated. So for example, years ago, Kashmiri writers started to document and write about the use of pellet bullets that are intentionally designed and created to blind people. And that's what they do, right? And so it was sort of famously written by a Kashmiri author, Mirza Wahid, who talked about how Kashmir was the site of the world's first blinding. Those same pellet guns, those same bullets have since been used on activists and protesters in Europe, in Argentina, and other parts of the world. And so we have a responsibility to address Kashmir for its own sake, because atrocities are underway, but also because, again, this architecture is also being used, and these militarization techniques are also being used elsewhere. And then one final observation, and that is specifically regarding India. For too long, India has gotten a pass as the world's largest democracy. The thing is, democracies only work if people can speak freely, if they can associate freely, if they can truth tell, if there is a diversity of political parties, if journalists can freely publish. And what we are seeing in India today is what I would argue the coalescence of an extraordinarily dangerous set of forces. You have a culture of impunity that goes back to what's happened in Kashmir, the genocide against Sikhs in the 80s, enforced disappearances in places like Punjab, Nagaland, Kashmir. Of course, lack of accountability in Gujarat. This culture of lawlessness, right, that's connected to this culture of impunity. You have these imperial ambitions, right? Again, Kashmir is a prime example. And then you have rising authoritarianism. And by that, I mean, again, internet blackouts. The idea that in India today, Munawar Farooqi, a young Muslim comedian, can be arrested for cracking a joke that he never even told. The idea that India has now imposed or is set to impose a 36-hour firewall, right? That will apply to every social media company, such that India can order any social media post to be taken down. And if it's not, the employees of those companies can be arrested and put in jail, right? The idea that any journalist today can face sedition charges for reporting on the farmers' protest, right? We've seen journalists, the executive editors from The Caravan, The Wire, and others be charged with sedition. Their offices be raided for just reporting and documenting what's happening on the ground. And then finally, we've also seen Hindutva supremacy, right? This idea that Hindus should enjoy privileged status in India, and all other faiths and all other communities should enjoy a tertiary or non-relevant status. And really, Hindutva supremacy, in some ways, isn't very dissimilar to white supremacy here in the United States. They're both supremacist frameworks that are being used to target, disenfranchise, and in some cases, even murder communities who are different from them. And so I just want to, again, end by emphasizing that we need to pay special attention to Kashmir on its own sake, but also because that framework and those technologies and those militarization acts of violence that we've seen are being replicated elsewhere. And we need to pay special attention to India because of the coalescence of all of these dark forces that are also in so many ways spreading to other parts of the world.
Thank you, Arjun, for your very extensive talk on the subject. And really today,